April 11, 1951, Washington, D.C. President Harry Truman sat at his desk in the Oval Office and signed one of the most explosive orders of his presidency. He was firing General Douglas MacArthur, the most famous general in America, a man millions considered a hero, a man who had just won one of the most brilliant victories of the Korean War. Truman knew what would happen next: the backlash, the accusations, the political firestorm. But what most people don't know is what happened after. What happened when MacArthur returned to America and mounted his defense, when he testified before Congress, when he gave speeches defending his strategy and his conduct, when he made his case to the American people that he had been right and Truman had been wrong. And what most people definitely don't know is how Truman responded to MacArthur's defense, what he said, what he believed, and why he never backed down from the decision that nearly destroyed his presidency. To understand what happened between Truman and MacArthur, we need to go back to the beginning, back to when these two men first crossed paths in the complex landscape of American power. They could not have been more different. Truman was a farmer's son from Missouri, no college education. He had failed in business. He got into politics through a political machine. He worked his way up slowly, methodically, without flash or brilliance. When Franklin Roosevelt died in April 1945, Truman became president almost by accident. He was the vice president nobody knew, the man who had to fill the shoes of a giant. MacArthur, by contrast, was American royalty. His father had been a famous general. MacArthur graduated first in his class at West Point. He was a hero of World War I. He had been Army Chief of Staff. By 1945, he was Supreme Commander in the Pacific, accepting Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri. He was everything Truman was not: aristocratic, confident, certain of his own greatness. Their first meeting came in October 1950 on Wake Island in the Pacific. The Korean War had started in June. North Korea had invaded South Korea. American forces under MacArthur's command had been pushed back to a small perimeter around Busan. Then MacArthur pulled off the Incheon landing, one of the most brilliant military operations in history. Suddenly, the war seemed won. MacArthur was pushing north toward the Chinese border. Truman wanted to meet with MacArthur, to discuss strategy, to make sure they were on the same page. MacArthur was reluctant. He didn't think he should have to leave his command, but he went. The meeting at Wake Island was brief. MacArthur assured Truman that China would not enter the war. He said the war would be over by Thanksgiving. Truman left cautiously satisfied. MacArthur returned to his command.
Within weeks, everything MacArthur had predicted proved wrong. China did enter the war, not with a few volunteers, as MacArthur had dismissed, but with hundreds of thousands of troops. They poured across the Yalu River in late November 1950. American forces were caught off guard. They were pushed back. The retreat was chaotic. Men died in the freezing Korean winter. It was one of the worst military setbacks in American history. MacArthur was shocked. He had been certain China wouldn't intervene. Now that they had, he wanted to expand the war. Bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, blockade the Chinese coast, use nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan, even consider using atomic weapons. He sent recommendations to Washington, urgent requests for permission to take the war to China. Truman said no, and this is where the real conflict began. Truman believed in limited war. The goal in Korea was to push the communists back to the border, not to conquer North Korea or start World War III with China. The Soviet Union had atomic weapons now. A wider war in Asia could trigger a global catastrophe. Truman had to think about Europe, about NATO, about the bigger picture. MacArthur thought about Korea, about victory, about not accepting stalemate. The disagreement became public. MacArthur began making statements that contradicted administration policy. He wrote a letter to Congressman Joseph Martin that was read on the House floor, criticizing the strategy of limited war. He gave interviews suggesting he knew better than the politicians in Washington. He implied that Truman was weak, that America was losing because of political interference. Truman was furious. He later wrote in his diary that MacArthur was insubordinate, that he was trying to dictate foreign policy, that he was challenging civilian control of the military. For weeks, Truman consulted with his advisors. What should he do? Could he really fire MacArthur, the most famous general in America, the hero of World War II? His advisors were divided. Some urged caution. Firing MacArthur would be politically explosive. It could destroy Truman's presidency. Others said it had to be done. MacArthur was openly defying the commander-in-chief. The principle of civilian control was at stake. If MacArthur could ignore presidential orders, then the Constitution meant nothing. On April 10, 1951, Truman made his decision. He would fire MacArthur. Not because MacArthur's military judgment was wrong, though Truman thought it was, but because MacArthur refused to follow orders, because he was making public statements that undermined American foreign policy, because he was trying to force the president's hand. The order was drafted. It was supposed to be delivered to MacArthur privately, with dignity, but word leaked to the press. To prevent MacArthur from learning about his firing from the newspapers, Truman held a press conference at 1 in the morning on April 11. He announced that General MacArthur was being relieved of all his commands, that Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway would replace him. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Newspapers across the country condemned Truman. Republican politicians called it a disaster. Millions of Americans were outraged. How dare Truman fire MacArthur? Who did this failed haberdasher think he was? MacArthur was invited to address a joint session of Congress. When he returned to the United States, millions lined the streets to see him. His homecoming was triumphant. He was treated like a conquering hero. And then MacArthur began his defense. On April 19, 1951, just 8 days after his firing, MacArthur stood before Congress and delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. The chamber was packed. Every senator, every representative, every gallery seat was filled. Millions more listened on radio. This was MacArthur's moment, his chance to defend himself, to explain his position, to make his case against the president who had fired him. MacArthur spoke for 34 minutes. His voice was strong, clear, emotional. He defended his strategy in Korea. He argued that there was no substitute for victory, that wars should be fought to win, not to reach stalemate. He criticized the policy of limited war. He said that fighting with one hand tied behind your back was a betrayal of the soldiers who were dying. He argued that he had been proven right about military matters time and again, from the Philippines to Japan to Incheon. And then came the famous ending. MacArthur quoted an old barracks ballad, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." He said that he, like the old soldier of that ballad, would now fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye. The chamber erupted in applause. Many were in tears. It was masterful, dramatic, unforgettable. Truman watched on television from the White House. He sat stone-faced. When asked later what he thought of the speech, Truman was blunt. He said it was nothing but a bunch of bullshit. Those were his exact words to his staff. A bunch of bullshit. Truman didn't buy MacArthur's defense, not for a second. But MacArthur wasn't finished. After his congressional speech, he went on a speaking tour. San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, New York. Everywhere he went, crowds gathered. People wanted to see him, to hear him, to show their support. And everywhere he went, MacArthur defended himself. He explained his strategy. He argued that Truman had been wrong, that the administration's policy was doomed to fail, that America needed to fight to win. Then came the Senate hearings. The Senate Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee held joint hearings on MacArthur's dismissal. They lasted for weeks, 7 weeks to be exact. Senators questioned MacArthur extensively. He testified for 3 full days, May 3rd, 5th, and 7th. He laid out his case in detail. He explained why he believed China should be bombed, why the war should be expanded, why limited war was wrong. MacArthur was compelling. He spoke with authority, with conviction, with the confidence of a man who had been proven right many times before. He argued that his recommendations would have ended the war, that they would have saved American lives, that they would have dealt a serious blow to communist expansion in Asia. But under questioning, cracks began to appear in MacArthur's defense. When asked if he understood that bombing China might bring the Soviet Union into the war, MacArthur dismissed the concern. When asked if he knew that America's European allies strongly opposed expanding the war, MacArthur said their opinions shouldn't matter. When pressed on whether he had publicly disagreed with administration policy while still in command, MacArthur defended his actions as speaking the truth. The senators then called other witnesses: Secretary of Defense George Marshall, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Omar Bradley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, delivered devastating testimony. He said that MacArthur's strategy would have led to the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy. He explained that America's priority had to be Europe, not Asia, that a wider war in Korea would weaken NATO and play into Soviet hands, that MacArthur's recommendations had been considered and rejected by all the military leadership.
Truman followed the hearings closely. He read the testimony. He consulted with his advisors, and his position never wavered. He believed MacArthur had been insubordinate, that the general had put his own judgment above the decisions of his civilian superiors, that he had violated the fundamental principle of civilian control of the military. In his diary and in conversations with his staff, Truman was even more blunt about MacArthur's defense. He said MacArthur was a troublemaker, that he had always been a troublemaker, that he had caused problems during World War II with his demands for more resources and his tendency to go around the chain of command. Truman told his aides that MacArthur had been insubordinate from the start, that firing him had been the only option. When reporters asked Truman about MacArthur's testimony, Truman's responses were carefully measured in public. He said he had made his decision and stood by it, that the principle of civilian control was paramount, that no general, no matter how distinguished, could dictate policy to the president. But privately, Truman was less diplomatic. He said MacArthur was full of himself, that the general believed his own press clippings, that he couldn't admit when he was wrong. The hearings went on through May and into June 1951. More witnesses testified, more details emerged, and gradually public opinion began to shift. At first, most Americans had been outraged by MacArthur's firing, but as the testimony unfolded, as the military leadership explained why MacArthur's strategy had been rejected, as the risks of wider war became clear, people began to have doubts. The hearings revealed something important. MacArthur had been wrong about Chinese intervention. He had predicted they wouldn't enter the war, and they had. He had underestimated their numbers and their capabilities. His intelligence assessments had been flawed, and when faced with this failure, he had wanted to escalate rather than adapt. The hearings also revealed that MacArthur had repeatedly defied his orders. He had been told not to make public statements about policy. He had done it anyway. He had been told to clear statements with Washington. He had ignored those instructions. He had been warned multiple times, and he had continued to believe he knew better than everyone else.
Truman watched as MacArthur's defense gradually lost its power. The initial outrage faded. The calls for Truman's impeachment quieted. The Senate hearings ended without any action against Truman. No censure, no condemnation. Just a lot of testimony that, in the end, supported Truman's decision more than it supported MacArthur's defense. MacArthur eventually faded from the headlines, just as he had predicted. In 1952, there was brief talk of him running for president. He gave the keynote address at the Republican National Convention, but the energy wasn't there. The party nominated Dwight Eisenhower instead. MacArthur retreated to New York to an office in the Waldorf Towers. He wrote his memoirs, he gave occasional speeches, but his moment had passed. Through it all, Truman maintained his position. When asked if he had any regrets about firing MacArthur, Truman always said no, never. It had been the right decision, the necessary decision, the only decision. When asked about MacArthur's defense, about his congressional speech, about his testimony, Truman dismissed it all. He said MacArthur was defending the indefensible, that no amount of rhetoric could change the fact that he had been insubordinate. In his memoirs, published in the 1950s, Truman devoted significant space to the MacArthur firing. He laid out his reasoning in detail. He explained why MacArthur's strategy had been wrong, why expanding the war would have been catastrophic, why civilian control of the military was a sacred principle that could not be compromised. And he made clear that MacArthur's eloquent defense didn't change any of the fundamental facts. MacArthur had defied his commander-in-chief, and that was unacceptable. Truman also wrote about watching MacArthur's congressional speech. He said it was a performance, that MacArthur had always been good at performances, but that speeches and testimony couldn't change reality. The reality was that MacArthur had been wrong about China, wrong about the risks of wider war, and wrong to think he could publicly contradict administration policy while still in command. The two men never reconciled. They saw each other one final time at President Kennedy's funeral in November 1963. They were both old men by then. Truman was 79, MacArthur was 83. They were seated near each other during the service. According to witnesses, they exchanged brief, formal pleasantries, nothing more. No real conversation, no resolution. Just two old warriors acknowledging each other's presence before returning to silence. MacArthur died in April 1964, exactly 13 years after his firing. Truman was asked to attend the funeral. He declined. He sent a brief statement of condolence, but he would not attend. Even in death, Truman maintained his position. MacArthur had been wrong, and all of his eloquent defenses couldn't change that fact. Truman lived another 8 years. He died in December 1972 at the age of 88. In his final years, he was asked many times about MacArthur, about the firing, about MacArthur's defense, and his answer never changed. MacArthur had been insubordinate. The firing had been justified, and all of MacArthur's speeches and testimony were just attempts to justify actions that couldn't be justified. What did Truman say when MacArthur defended himself? He said that MacArthur's eloquence, popularity, and military reputation did not excuse insubordination or defiance of civilian authority, that speeches and testimony couldn't change the facts, that MacArthur had defied his orders and had to be fired. Truman said it privately to his staff. He said it in his memoirs. He said it for the rest of his life, and he never wavered. Truman understood something fundamental. The issue wasn't about military strategy. It wasn't about whether MacArthur's plan would have worked.
It was about whether the President of the United States could control his military commanders, whether civilian leadership would prevail over military judgment, whether the Constitution would hold. MacArthur's defense was brilliant. His congressional speech was one of the greatest speeches ever delivered in that chamber. His testimony was detailed and compelling, but none of it addressed the core issue. None of it justified his public defiance of administration policy. None of it explained why he should have been allowed to continue in command after repeatedly violating his orders. The conflict between Truman and MacArthur represents one of the most important constitutional moments in American history. And it was resolved the way the founders intended. The civilian president prevailed. The general was fired. No matter how eloquent his defense, no matter how many people lined the streets to see him, no matter how many tears were shed at his speeches, the principle of civilian control was upheld. In the decades since, most historians have sided with Truman. They recognize the courage it took to fire the most popular general in America. They understand that Truman sacrificed his political standing to defend a constitutional principle, that he knew the decision would damage his presidency, but he made it anyway because it was right.
MacArthur remains one of the greatest military minds America has ever produced. His brilliance is undeniable. His contributions to American victory in World War II were immense. But his firing stands as a permanent reminder that in America, no one is above the law. No one is so indispensable that they can defy the president, no matter how brilliant their defense, no matter how compelling their arguments. What Truman said when MacArthur defended himself was expressed both in words and in silence. In his blunt dismissals of MacArthur's speeches, in his steadfast defense of his decision, in his refusal to attend MacArthur's funeral, in his unwavering commitment to the principle that had cost him so much politically. Truman's message was clear and consistent. The Constitution matters more than any individual. Civilian control is not negotiable, and no defense, however eloquent, can justify insubordination. That message resonates today. In a world where military leaders are often celebrated as heroes, where generals are seen as beyond criticism, Truman's firing of MacArthur stands as a crucial reminder. The military serves the nation, commanders follow orders, and when they don't, they get fired. No matter who they are, no matter how famous, no matter how brilliantly they defend themselves afterward. Truman paid a heavy price for that principle. His approval ratings plummeted. His presidency was damaged. He left office deeply unpopular. But history has vindicated Harry Truman. Today, he is remembered as one of America's great presidents, not because he was eloquent like MacArthur, but because he had the courage to do what was right, even when it was hard, even when the whole country seemed to be against him, even when the man he fired defended himself with some of the most powerful speeches ever delivered in American politics. That's the real story of what Truman said when MacArthur defended himself. He said that eloquence doesn't excuse insubordination, that brilliant speeches don't change the facts, that in America, the Constitution comes first, always.
The information presented in this video is derived from published memoirs, presidential papers, congressional records, Senate testimony transcripts, and scholarly biographies cited in the sources. While every effort has been made to ensure accuracy, historical interpretations may vary among scholars and historians. Viewers are encouraged to consult the listed sources for comprehensive research and alternative perspectives. This content is intended for educational purposes.